Recently, I was very privileged to talk to Dr. Jonathan Lyonhart about the relevance of Plato and Platonism to contemporary theology. Now, he is Associate Professor of Christianity and Philosophy at the University of Jamestown in the US. Now, this happened for about 30 minutes, as you will see, but then organically it developed into a debate between me representing Islam and Dr. Jonathan Lyonhart representing Christianity. So it was a Muslim-Christian debate about salvation, about Jesus upon whom be peace, about all sorts of things central to Christian doctrine, the incarnation and the Trinity and so on. So I just wanted to flag this up because this was doesn't begin as a debate, and it was never intended to be one. But thanks to Dr. Jonathan Lyonhart's very gracious acceptance, it just turned into a debate. And I think it was a very positive, respectful discussion/debate. And it starts around about 30 minutes onwards. So the first 30 minutes is devoted to questions of Plato and Socrates and how relevant his worldview is to a contemporary understanding of metaphysics. And then it just morphs into, as I say, this debate about Christian themes and the Islamic perspective on these themes and the Islamic alternative. So I just wanted to flag this up because you wouldn't necessarily know if you sat through the first 30 minutes that there was a debate actually going to happen. It was unscripted. It wasn't supposed to happen, but both of us are very happy it did happen. And inshallah, he and I will do another podcast where we would just have a debate. But this is kind of an introduction to that, perhaps. Enjoy, and please leave your comments in the description below. As I say, the debate starts at around about 31 minutes onwards for the rest of the video. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I am delighted to talk to Dr. Jonathan Lyonhart. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for having me.
It's a great honor to have you. For those who don't know, Jonathan, by the way, who did his PhD at Cambridge University, is a Canadian theologian, philosopher, author, and ordained minister. He's Associate Professor of Christianity and Philosophy at the University of Jamestown, a Fellow at the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism at Cambridge University, and a co-host of the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. Fantastic title. I'll link to it in the description below. And is the author of a book titled Monotheism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub, which has got to be the most unusual book title I've ever read. So congratulations on that. Also, he's written Space God, Rejudging a Debate Between Moore, Newton and Einstein, and his upcoming book titled The Journey of God, Christianity in 6 Movements. And if you look closely enough, folks, you can see some of those titles just behind his head. Monotheism, I can see that, and Space God. So now we were discussing what might be the relevance, if any, of Platonism to contemporary theology. Briefly, if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us who Plato was, when did he live, and what are his most famous works?
Yeah, so Plato is a Greek philosopher. He was a student of, he was a disciple, follower, student of Socrates, who's, famous Socrates, who's always pestering people with all of these questions. And then, of course, Socrates gets put to death, drinks the hemlock, and Plato kind of rises to the fore in his place. And a lot of what we know about Socrates is through Plato. So there's this huge debate about what is Socrates and what is Plato, because Plato is our primary source for who Socrates was. But either way, the two of them, their two worldviews somehow merged in the writings of Plato, preserve this really interesting body of dialogues where Plato writes conversations between different people and Socrates, going back and forth as he sort of dissects everything that people normally think about themselves, about the universe, about the gods, about meaning, morality. And it's just a blast. Plato's one of my favorite people to read because he writes the conversational dialogue, which, I mean, that my book, Monotheism, the absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems, that's written as a dialogue at a pub because I so adore Plato's approach to truth, both in the sense that it should be conversational. It shouldn't be a bunch of abstractions floating above existence. It should be embodied. But what's ironic about what I just said is that Plato is often caricatured for being disembodied and irrelevant to the material world and the proto-Gnostic. And the reason is because he has this theory of forms, which is this idea that underlying the world of diversity and difference, there are unified forms to everything. And so, how does the mind see a chair and think, oh, that's a chair? Well, because your mind has the form of chairness in its head. That's how it can look at my couch. It can look at that chair. It can look at a stool and identify that although they are materially diverse and different and distinct, they're unified in this underlying form of chairness. They are things that butts are placed upon. Chairness, right? Like you sit in them. And that might seem tedious when it comes to something like a chair, but it becomes much more exciting and interesting when it comes to things like goodness or beauty. Is there an eternal, objective, absolute form for the good? Or do we just have thousands of different, diverse, alternative theories of what is the good, and they're all socially relative to time, place, context, and culture? And if that's the case, some believe that we would be left with relativism. There would be no objective standard or essence or form of the good. And so in that conversation, Plato becomes immediately relevant because he's giving us a framework to say, no, we're not just stuck with culturally relative views of what is right and wrong and true. There are objective, eternal forms that are higher than humanity and higher than the constant flux of social and cultural norms. There is really something called the good, and we really can align with it or fall short of it. And so our lives really do have objective meaning. And so that's kind of the theory of the forms in very brief and quick, and sort of a background to who Plato is. So
that's a beautiful summary, I must say. And you'll find more about that actually in his magnum opus, arguably his greatest work, Plato's Republic. Which I'm now reading it for the second time, purely in dialogue form, mostly with Socrates chatting to other guys in Athens, mainly. Theory of forms is in there, and a whole bunch of other really fascinating things as well. So I do recommend that. So you're saying that Plato, or Platonisms, because it later became a doctrine, didn't it? Perhaps later on, emphasis on a transcendent realm of unchanging forms, ideas, provides a framework for understanding God as the ultimate reality beyond the material world. And so it's kind of like this intellectual scaffolding by which we can understand the relationship between the ephemeral, the sense perception, and the unchanging form of the good, or God, as he's known. But how does that relate to what some might call Abrahamic faith, the faith of Abraham, or the faith of Moses and Jesus and others, peace be upon them all? How does that relate to it? Because they're often characterized rightly as based on revelation, or based on events in history, rather than a philosophical, metaphysical concept of transcendence. Do you see what I mean? How do you connect the two?
Yeah, so I'll give you a historical justification, historically how they merged, and then we can talk about whether they had to merge philosophically. Historically, at least in the Christian tradition, there's a lot of different places where the merger takes place, but the infamous one is that St. Augustine took the forms of Plato and said, well, these forms that Plato talks about, they don't just hover somewhere beyond space and time disembodied. Because, I mean, where is the number 6? Does the number 6 exist somewhere out there? And if we just traveled far enough past Andromeda, we'd find the number 6? No, because the number 6 and ideas like goodness are not objects in the world. They're thoughts in a mind.
Right.
The mind thinks sixness, the mind thinks of goodness and then sees it out there, but the number 6 doesn't exist out there. It's a mental thing. And so Augustine kind of makes this move where he says, what if the forms of Plato are the thoughts of the divine mind? The forms are the thoughts swirling about eternally. It's not like God's thinking, oh, that's a good idea, I should come up with this. It's not like spontaneous in that way, but it's almost like the forms are the structure and thoughts of an eternal, absolute, objective mind. And And so that's kind of historically how that plays out. And I do think there is some philosophical persuasiveness to that, precisely because of what I just said. We don't think of sixness or goodness or beauty as objects existing out there. Those are concepts or ideas, and concepts and ideas exist in minds. Yep. So the forms disembodied is a very hard thing to wrap yourself around, but the forms as thoughts in a mind are quite an intuitive thing. Yeah. And if you then take sort of an idealistic approach to ultimate reality, then the forms as thought are the absolute. Mind is absolute in that kind of universe. And there's some other justifications I've sometimes made for the forms not just being abstract or impersonal, but specifically theistic and personal. Am I hitting your audience at the right level, or am I going too high or too low here? Because
you can never go high enough for my audience.
Your audience is just brilliant. Okay, great.
Awesome. Theology for a reason.
Oh, great. I'm always with undergraduates, and I'm constantly having to tell myself to shut up and slow down. Anyway,
please speed up and carry on.
Another thing that I think makes the forms particularly well suited to the mind of a theistic God is because there's an element to them that can be personal. And when you think about something like goodness, moral goodness, that's not just an abstract law of the universe that applies indifferently to all things, the way that, say, the law of gravity does, right? If the law of gravity applies to everything. If I jump, I'm going to come back down. I'm a personal being, but gravity applies to me. But it also applies to impersonal beings, right? If you drop a piano, it's going to fall from the second floor and it's going to come down. And so the laws of gravity and most of the scientific laws apply indifferently to both personal beings and impersonal objects. But a number of the forms apply only to personal entities. Such, when you think about love, right? Or these types of things, or morality, we see those as binding upon personal agents. If when Paul, the Apostle Paul, stoned Stephen, the Rock didn't feel any guilt about it later, right? Because it's not a personal being. But Paul eventually did feel moral guilt about it. He felt the law calling upon him. And so impersonal objects the forms don't apply just indifferently across the impersonal personal divide the way that the laws of science do. Some of them apply personally, intimately to personal beings and moral agents such as humans, and perhaps you could argue about other personal beings like dogs or dolphins or elephants or something, but though only in as much as they are very personal, right? And so there's something about the moral forms that are personal and require their source to be personal in a way that the laws of science and material laws are not, because they apply indifferently to all things. Whether you're a personal being or a rock, it doesn't matter. If you're thrown from a plane, you're going down.
Can I just clarify about this personal source of these moral forms? I mean, in reading Plato's dialogues, say the Republic, and there are many other very, very short ones as well as other long ones, one gets the sense sometimes he speaks about, or others characters speak about God, sometimes they speak about the divine, sometimes they speak about God, singular. And there's a sense of a kind of a lack of kind of consistency or kind of clearly defined theology anyway, when it comes to exactly what Plato or Socrates, his main character, actually believe about the transcendent realm. So is Plato a monotheist? Is he a henotheist, to use the jargon? Is he a polytheist? What is he? Because it's one thing to talk about the personal nature of the source, which I get, but the other thing is this source one, or is it many? Is it pluralistic? Is it, so I'm confused. Could you clarify that?
No, I think that confusion is an accurate confusion, because Plato has so many different dialogues, and precisely because they are dialogues, you're getting a multiplicity of perspectives.
Right.
And so it's hard to know who Plato is in the dialogue. Like you usually assume, oh, he's Socrates.
Yeah.
But there's places where that's not always the case. And even Socrates isn't Plato. What's Plato and what's Socrates? What is Plato recounting what Socrates says, and what is Plato saying what he says? And I think precisely because of the dialogue format, you can kind of throw out ideas and discuss them and debate them back and forth, and all the different characters can take a different side of that debate. And it's really hard to know which one actually is what Plato thinks. And so I think your confusion isn't like, oh, you just need to study more and you'll figure it out. I think some of that confusion is just in Plato himself. And
the ambiguity is there in his work. It's not just my ignorance. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't think it's I don't think it's a mistake necessarily. I think it's the beauty of the complexity of the world being reflected in the one who's thinking about it. And there's a similar feeling in David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. The first time I read that, I assumed Hume was the atheist character who just rejected everything with God, right? Yeah. But, when you reread it a few more times, you're like, oh, well, maybe he actually does sympathize with these characters more, and he's more agnostic, or he's feeling the tension of these things. Mm-hmm. And, scholars can take whatever stance they want and say, well, this is the real David Hume, but he's presenting himself in a myriad of ways, perhaps for a reason. And that ambiguity is perhaps not concealing a deeper solidity, but perhaps just is the ambiguity of the thinker himself. Like, people always want us to say as philosophers what we think, and I usually just want to give them a conversation because I don't know what to think. I'm just torn between polar opposites and tensions, and I don't know how to resolve them, but I know that somewhere in those tensions is the truth.
Yeah.
So
I remember, but I'm reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit at the moment. One's constantly struck by not always being very clear what is Hegel's own position. He in fact, he's been co-opted by the young Hegelians and the older Hegelians. People on the right love him, people on the left love him, and each seems to have a very different take and can point to stuff in Hegel's corpus that seems to support their views. So there's certain kind of plasticity or ambiguity that I think is built into Hegel. His dialectical method, anyway, is quite sophisticated. So he seems to affirm and not affirm at the same time. And I get the similar sense with Plato's dialogues. He will not be pinned down. He's asking questions, he's exploring, he's suggesting, he's critiquing, but he's not like a dogmatist. He's not telling you, like Chairman Socrates will now tell you the truth about life. That just doesn't happen, does it?
No, and that would be so antithetical to the spirit of Socrates himself, because anytime someone thinks that they know, that the whole point is he's wise because he doesn't know. He's the only person who knows that he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? That's Socrates' wisdom, and it comes from constantly peppering everything that you take for granted with more questions. So yeah, I think that's just the spirit of the Socratic thing that Plato's doing.
Yeah. So and the people that they've been very famous Christian theologians who've hated him. For example, Martin Luther, who was almost against reason. He detests all kind of rational discourse. He's all for faith, none of this kind of reason stuff. And so Plato's reputation has suffered, particularly at the Reformation, big time. And in the Islamic tradition, of course, Islamic theologians like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina have incorporated Platonic ideas, particularly regarding the necessary being, wajab al-wujub, and they have come under huge criticism as well from other Muslim theologians, obviously Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, particularly. So none of these figures, Plato, Socrates, we haven't mentioned Aristotle, this great triumvirate that knew each other. They're literally one taught the other. None of them have been co-opted wholeheartedly by Muslims, Christians, or Jews. The Jewish Maimonides, of course, co-opted a lot of Greek thought as well, but had been influential, but not without their critics from within their traditions.
Yeah, which is great, and I think Plato would love that. Don't just take what I'm saying here. Question me. Do what I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. So can we just move on, perhaps, to Plato or Platonism? Plato and Platonism are not the same thing, of course. Platonism being perhaps the later dogmatic formulation of Plato's thought in several centuries later, particularly in the Philo of Alexandria and Christianity. You mentioned Augustine, but their critique of secularism and materialism in today's world, in our secular age where materialism often dominates. Does Plato or Platonism offer a critique by emphasizing the primary of the spiritual, perhaps, in the intelligible over the material? Is he a thinker who has great utility and relevance to 2025?
Yeah. So for me, I don't know if he has to for all theological systems, but at least for me, a lot of it comes back to Plato. And in most of my books, I kind of start as the prolegomena almost with saying, you can either assume there is this absolute objective world of meaning, beauty, and goodness, or you can kind of go the other direction and say that's relative and, socially constructed.
Yeah.
And if you go the socially constructed route, okay, like theology has nothing to really say to you. I don't know. I mean, it can critique you and say that's just not accurate to your lived experience. But if you make that leap to the eternal, the transcendent, I think then you have an anchor point upon which theology can build. And I don't want to say is then a science, but there's something solid there.
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of people, our experience of the objectivity of morality is as real, if not more real, than our sense of the objectivity of the material world. The example I use in my book that I've coming out is, when I went and visited a concentration camp, and I was standing on this field of a mass grave that hadn't been dug up, like they were still there under there. And I had this sense that, like, it was almost like my experience that was objectively wrong and horrible was more epistemically overwhelming than my experience that the field was actually, like, that it was more, I am more convinced that the Holocaust was wrong than I am that matter is real. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that if we pause and think about it, most of us would probably say something like that. We are as convinced of our moral intuitions as we are that the material world exists. And
so can I ask you? It's a very interesting observation you make there. So you're in a was this in Poland perhaps, or in?
It was in Dachau.
Yeah, in Poland. Yeah. So you have this profound instinctual sense of the wrongness and malevolence, the evil of what you were standing next to, or even though it was underground, that was more real to you, impressed upon itself more than just the sense perception of what you were seeing, fields, trees, clouds. That moral sense was very powerful. And I hear that, and that's totally authentic. But why I would question that, perhaps very controversially, is that sense doesn't seem to work very often. For example, you're Canadian, is that right? So
yeah.
Fine. So I'm not going to upset you. Let's talk about some Americans.
Let's do it. It's my favorite thing to do.
Americans. Okay. Most Americans, bless them, and I'm not saying it's their fault, but many Americans appear to be profoundly at peace with what many people call as a genocide that's happened in Gaza, in Palestine. Amnesty International, if you go on their website, have listed a huge amount of evidence, both in terms of tensions and speeches and actions and actual killings on a mass scale of innocent men, women, and children. And so this certainly classifies as genocide. Now, without getting into the arguments about that, I'm just struck that a lot of people seem quite happy about that. I have no problem about it whatsoever. Really, they're only concerned about Israeli hostages. And of course, hostages, there shouldn't be hostages, but they're concerned about the Israeli hostages and nothing else. So this moral compass that seems so primordial, seems so fundamental to your moral compass that you rightly and very amazingly testify in Dachau concentration camp, doesn't seem to operate in other circumstances where mass killings of innocent people have taken place. And that's why I'm questioning its operation in practice. It doesn't seem to work like that. It does in your case, and I'm not questioning your, but in other people's case, which I'm picking on Americans here, it doesn't seem to operate quite so well. Do you see what I mean? Or am I
totally? I'd say I'll say a few things. The first thing I'll say is the Holocaust example probably wasn't the best contextualizing example for you. I don't know, but I could have used a different example. What I would say is that I think we have that primordial sense. But it doesn't mean it can't be deadened.
Right.
And what's interesting is the examples you just used, those are the same types of things that can negate people's experience of the material world. There are people who, whether through psychedelic drugs or through insanity or all of these types of things can detach from the objectivity of the material world and no longer know what is real, what is fantasy, what is actually there. And so, yeah, I agree. We can undermine our epistemic access to reality, both moral, but also material.
Yeah.
The objection cuts in all directions.
Very
That
interesting.
if you want to sever yourself from reality, both physical, moral, aesthetic, you can. And I think with the American example, I mean, if you allow evil to go on in your midst long enough and you take baby steps further and further, you might have felt something initially, but eventually, that can be deadened.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't think what's happening. So for example, with the immigration stuff in America right now, I don't think that could have just happened. I think the American public need to be primed with years and years of anti-immigration rhetoric to get to the point that they're at now. Because if they had this upfront presented to them without baby steps where they morally become anesthetized, like what's that word when you take a little bit of a,
homeopathic medicine, where you take something.
When you take a little bit of something and then it, anyways, I think if we were doing what we did right now, years and years ago, perhaps before 9/11, I think there would have been a moral outcry, but we've slowly deadened some of those senses more and more. And I also think that, to some extent, people compartmentalize. There are people who, if they were on the ground in Gaza and, like right now, they would be horrified. They would cry out, but they're choosing not to watch the news or to only watch the news that presents them with the narratives and the images that are comfortable for them. And so, it's a similar thing, not to just keep going back to the Holocaust, but I think the German people allowed that to happen for the most part, and were morally culpable. And yet most of those same people, when the Allies invaded and forced them to go to the camps that had been, a mile or two away, the people in the village, they forced them to come see what had happened. Most of them were horrified because even though they might morally should have known or should have faced it, they hadn't quite faced it. And when they faced it, they had the reaction that I'm talking about. Dear God, what have we done?
Right.
So I think it's still there, but it can get buried.
Well, what you said in terms of is actually found in the Islamic tradition in the work of Ibn Taymiyyah, this whole concept of the fitra, which is there in the Quran, it's there in the Hadith, but he developed it quite a lot, actually, extended the concept. He had a sense that we are in our essential nature good, and we do have this sense of right and wrong and justice and a sense of God, but it can be corrupted. It can be damaged by our environment, our choices, the moral choices we make, and this is more or less the same concept, I think. So that's very interesting.
Well, and also, like I was saying, our access to truth. It's not just beauty and goodness in the Platonic frame that can be diluted in your access to it. It's truth, both in the sense of, does the material world exist? And if you get high enough and you don't necessarily think that, but also in terms of what that material world's truths are. And this is where you get sort of vaccine denial and all of these other types of things where, people can choose to cut off access to truth in the same way that they choose to cut off access to beauty and goodness. I just think our society has made a virtue of relativizing beauty and goodness and not of relativizing truth. But I don't think it needed to do that. And it was rather arbitrary that it picked one to negate and not the others.
Right. So you're saying that the Platonic view can offer an objective good, which provides a philosophical foundation for universal ethics, which is grounded not in subjective choice, but in divine reality. So it has an objectivity in it. And this has a theological application. So there's an objective moral order, which is grounded in God. And this can be the kind of Plato's perhaps secular, well, not secular, but sort of non-Abrahamic, for a better term, structure that he can help us to frame our reality, perhaps. It's very interesting, actually.
Yeah, but sorry, go ahead.
No, but I was just wondering, are there any? I mean, I've heard that some scholars like David Bentley Hart, does he use Platonic thought to argue for that in his work. I mean, one of the books I've got by him, I don't know if you've read it, I'm sure you've come across it, The Experience of God.
Yeah. Sat Chitananda. Yeah. I think he's very much connecting to that Trinity in Plato, but he's also connecting to a more Eastern Sat Chitananda, being consciousness bliss. And he's seeing it as sort of this, I don't want to say perennial, because I know he's rejected a lot of perennial thought, but is something that unites a lot of these traditions. Perhaps not historically speaking, but in terms of what is ultimately real, we're kind of hitting at the same things in these different contexts. And so, yeah, I think that is, Hart's very eclectic. So I wouldn't say Plato's the only thing, but I think that's heavily in the mix.
Yeah. Actually, he's an example perhaps of a contemporary writer who's very widely read, who certainly affirms Plato's concepts in some ways. You just touched briefly there, if I may. You mentioned Dachau. A lot of this is about evil, basically, the nature of evil, the reality of evil, and how we encounter it. Does Plato have a sense? What is Plato's understanding of evil? His concept of evil? Is it an objective reality, evil, X, called evil, which we can point at and define, or is it that the absence of good? So I think this is Augustine's favored thing, isn't it? It's not like a positive thing. It's simply the absence of good leading to deficiency in moral goodness. Do you see what I mean? Is that?
Yeah.
To stand on that, do you think?
Yeah. To be honest, I mean, I'm in the Christian Platonic tradition, but I'm not a Plato scholar. So it would probably be better to ask a Plato scholar for Plato's specific view on that. My sense, though, has been that the Greek tradition tends to categorize evil not in terms of moral will or good and evil, but it's often in terms of knowledge. It's ignorance or enlightenment. And if you really knew correctly, then you would have chosen correctly.
Right.
And so some people, and I don't know how accurate this is historically, but some people have at least claimed philosophically that it's much more of an emphasis on will in the Christian tradition. I mean, going back to the Garden of Eden, this thing that, we freely chose evil. It's not just, we didn't know what we were doing. We were told what we were doing, and we made a choice. And so that the problem there is the abuse of the will, not the failure of the mental. And I think these different views of where evil comes from are very prevalent in society today. I think there's a huge tradition that says we just need to educate ourselves. Knowledge is power. And if society was just more literate, more aware of all of these things, then it would be better and we would have this sort of secular utopia. But I think sometimes that fails to take into account the will. Even if all humans have everything and everyone's equal and all of that, people are going to still choose stupid stuff because we have a will. And and as someone who's been to some of the most educated places in the world, like, I've been to Cambridge and stuff, the more you know does not lead to virtue. Those are not, I think they can connect because I do believe ultimately in the divine truth and goodness do align. But down here, in the diverse world, those are not yet merged. And so
it's not just in Cambridge. We see this in the history of Germany, of course, one of the most advanced, sophisticated, it's given us Goethe, Beethoven, Mozart, Einstein, you name it. The list is very long in science and culture and music and literature, on and on. And yet out of this extraordinary cultural crucible, we had the events that you experienced in Dachau. And they are connected. They're not just kind of a weird offshoot. There is a real sense that they are organically connected. So this is a great paradox.
Yeah, it is. And I think it needs to be talked about more. I see it. I see this a lot in, I don't want to say Hindu. I want to rather say very Western appropriations of Eastern thought. What would have in the 70s been New Age, and now is taking on a whole new range of terms. But this idea that humanity isn't broken or fallen, rather humanity descended from our divine state in order to learn something.
Right.
That we had to go through the process of being incarnated over and over again to learn some sort of lessons, but that fundamentally none of us are broken or flawed or evil. There's a lack of knowledge. And in order to chase that out, we who were once one with the divine descended into the world to learn these lessons. And then once we've learned them, then we return to oneness with the divine. And I struggle on those accounts where will and evil aren't factors to understand how it works. Because if the divine that we once were was lacking in knowledge, then it wasn't truly the divine. And so why did it need to separate itself out into these various incarnations to learn something? For me, it's only because the freedom of the will exists that you can get a fall narrative where goodness somehow leads to what we have here. I don't think without will in the narrative, you can make sense of how goodness leads to not goodness in the world around us. And a lot of people want to frame those narratives not as a moral falling, but as a lack of knowledge that needed to be attained. And you see this in a lot of New Age stuff. And I just have never been able to make sense of that narrative.
But those narratives exist not just in Hinduism, but in Christianity. So I mentioned Martin Luther again, and other Protestant thinkers, that the will is so fallen because of our parents, Adam and Eve, that we are incapable of free choice, that we are slaves basically to our sinful nature. And so we need this miraculous supernatural intervention to free us and bring us to some kind of freedom again, under God. So you get this very kind of binary worldview, the fallen and the saved realms, really. I'm not saying that's your belief, but that's a very powerful Protestant belief in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's part of me that definitely affirms aspects of this emphasis upon will, perhaps not in such a binary way where you're either all lost and all broken and totally unfree. I think there can be degrees of things, right? But what would you say from more Islamic tradition, how the will would be seen, and what's the problem? Why is the world the way that it is?
That's an excellent question. I think there are various. I mean, I'm not an expert, but there are some differences in anthropology as well as theology. So my understanding from the Quran is that we're created imperfect. So we're not created. So more to link it in with Christianity, more like the Irenaean understanding of theodicy than the Augustinian one, if I put it in those terms. So, for Augustine, we were Irenaeus, we weren't created as perfect beings in the Garden of Eden.
Naive.
We were naive. We were created to learn and grow and develop. So there's some similarities there. We were created imperfect. We're here briefly in this world to learn. So there's a similarity of what you were saying earlier, to be tested, to worship God alone, and to do good and to do God's will. But we're not catastrophically fallen in Islam. We're not unable to exercise our will. We do have free will, limited free will. And there's a sense of compatibilism, I think, where God is sovereign, has dominion, and has issued his decree throughout all things. But nevertheless, we do have a limited free will to choose the actions that we do. This is a controversial area, different views between the Asherites and other people as well. We'll go into that. But also, I think that another big difference is that sin is not a major problem in Islam. I get the sense in some iterations of Christianity, sin is a huge problem for God. And the only way he can solve the problem of sin is by torturing to death an innocent man on the cross. And that way sin is atoned for, and we can receive forgiveness and salvation. Islam is not like that. We believe that God is merciful and forgiving, actually, as he wishes to those who turn to him in faith. So there are these kind of slightly different ways of putting things, but there's an awful lot of overlap as well, however.
Yeah. No, I can see that for sure. I think I see sin in the same way that I might see generational sin, where the sins of the parents kind of get passed on to the kids. And that's a major factor, right? You see generational sin over and over again. Statistically, those who are abused are more likely to abuse. And yet people who are in those contexts still do have some agency, right? Like you still can minimally reject your past and how, so I see there being genuine sin passed down. And whether you want to make that genetic or social, that doesn't really matter to me. But experientially, I think it's a reality. And yet, I still don't think it totally negates our will in the way that Luther might say it totally negates our will. I think I think there's more degrees of color and shades in there than just all or nothing, for sure.
I think in Islam, we don't inherit the sin, guilt, or the sin of anyone else. We're only responsible for our own sin before God. But we can certainly experience the effects of other sins. So if my parents, say, abuse drugs or alcohol, and then I end up having kind of disposition perhaps to whatever, I'm not therefore a sinner for having that effect put upon me. It's the consequences of that are felt by me, but I have no moral guilt, unless, of course, I then activate a similar impulse freely, although my culpability then, of course, will be determined by how much free will I have. But the assumption isn't that there's zero freedom, or that I'm therefore sinful because I have that disposition. Feelings are not sinful necessarily at all. No. It is if I have a disposition to feel X, that's not sinful. Only if I act on it, it becomes possibly sinful before God.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is a discussion I've had a lot before, and I'm still struggling to figure it out, because I mean, obviously Christians believe God is graceful and merciful and loving as well, but we're seeing that as somehow in tension with God's just nature, and those two aspects only being reconciled at the cross. Yeah. And yet I also know that in Islam, God does seem to be just. And so how is it reconciling those attributes in the divine?
Well, I don't think God has to activate attributes in the divine, all of them simultaneously. He can choose to be forgiving, and that's not in competition with his justice necessarily, any more than a parent who forgives their child is not being just to that child, because God can choose as he wishes, according to his wisdom, according to his purposes and will, to show mercy to me, for example, rather than condemn me for other reasons. This is in the inscrutable wisdom of God, but I don't believe he's unjust by forgiving people. And I think there's also, I mean, this is going to stray into controversial area. I don't necessarily want to get into, because we're not here to discuss that, but there is a sense that torturing to death an innocent human being who is our substitute to atone for sin is not a demonstration of justice, because Jesus was innocent in that reading. He wasn't guilty. So sin isn't transferable. Guilt isn't transferable in Islam. We are morally responsible for our own behavior, and we can't impute guilt to other people who are innocent. Yeah. It's simply not possible, because that vitiates any idea of moral culpability and becomes like a coinage one can simply transfer from one person to another. So I think there's a strong sense of moral responsibility in Islam in that regard.
Yeah, I think, and we don't have to focus on this too much if you don't want to, but I think I'd say two things. And I think this does connect back to Platonism, because you were talking about God not having to activate all of God's nature. He can choose not to activate, or to activate a different aspect of it. Yeah. And I think in the Christian tradition, at least in our medieval tradition, and there might be some overlap here, there's this debate between a voluntaristic view of God and what some have termed a more rational view of God, which would almost see God as bound by the forms. And the voluntaristic would say, God isn't bound by his nature. He can make 2 + 2 = 5 because he's not bound by his rational nature. He can torture kids for fun because he's not bound by his moral nature. It doesn't mean he will do those things. It just means he has the freedom to do that. And so the Christian tradition really is struggling with this. And post-Reformation, the voluntaristic side takes over, precisely because of people like Martin Luther, which is ironic, because I think you can only make sense of a justice love thing on a more rationalistic framework where, in the sense of Platonic forms, God is love and God is justice, and he can't not be those things. He can't choose to be unloving, and he can't choose to be unjust any more than the forms could cease to be what they are, because then moral reality itself would be shattered. And so God has to be just and moral 100% all the time. He can't negate any aspect of his nature. And so those two things can't have to be reconciled in some way. And of course, the Christians say the cross, and we can get into whether that's a good attempt to reconcile it. But I don't think we would see it as an option, at least in the rationalist tradition, to say that God can set aside parts of himself or violate parts of himself or not enact all of who he is. And I think that does, for me, connect a lot to Plato, because I don't think God could do that any more than I could think that murder could suddenly be good, because there's an eternal absolute form that always is what it is and isn't changing. Does that make sense?
Oh, a lot of sense. We've had similar debates in a very early Christian tradition with the Mutazilites, who believe in the sense that God is just, and the sense that God is held to certain standards in his relationship with creation. And this, of course, is very uneasy with the mainstream Islamic tradition. God is not held to an independent standard, because that almost makes that standard above God. So the Mutazilite tradition was roundly criticized, actually. But there also are sayings in the Islamic tradition where God says, "My mercy prevails over my wrath. My mercy prevails over my wrath." So God ultimately will be merciful over his wrath in certain situations, certain people. So he's not like a robotic thing who's having to always march forth and impose certain absolute justice, in a kind of mechanical or rationalistic way. And I think this understanding of God is actually found quite powerfully, for me, in the teaching of Jesus, actually, in the Christian tradition, in the Gospels. Say, for example, the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, where the son is a parable, so it's not literal story, of course. But the son represents the sin. Off he goes, he leaves his father, commits all sorts of nefarious sins, realizes the bankruptcy and the pointlessness of that existence, and decides to return to the father, i.e. God. And the father welcomes him back and has mercy on him and throws a party, and everyone's happy. And this kind of compassion and acceptance of repentance and forgiveness is very much at the heart of Islam as well. And I don't think Jesus would have been very impressed if someone had challenged Jesus, say, "Well, look, Jesus, actually, are you really emphasizing the justice of God here? Perhaps the son should have been punished. Maybe he should have been whipped until he begged for mercy. And then once justice was satisfied, God can go on and be loving and forgive." All that is completely, in my view, alien to Jesus's outlook, as it is to the outlook of the other prophets of God, including Muhammad, upon him be peace. So I think there's a slight non-rationalistic take here. It's God's character, his names, as we call them in Islam, certainly manifest different attributes and characteristics. But we get the sense that God is free to relate to us as he pleases, and he's not necessitated by some rationalistic calculation of what should be justice in this situation or what should be wrath in this situation. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a personal God in that sense.
Yeah. You said so many things that I've started taking notes, because this is great. I'm loving this discussion, by the way.
Oh, you are. That's a relief. I don't want to feel that I'm getting I really love Jesus, and I think he's an extraordinary prophet of God. So I'm very happy to refer to him endlessly. But I don't think he's unique in that respect. I think he follows in a great tradition of other prophets and messengers of God who also speak in very similar ways. We see it in the Jewish Bible as well.
Yeah. Well, let me go kind of point by point through what you said and kind of what I was thinking, because I wanted to make sure I got all of it, because it was all very good and interesting. I think the first thing you were saying about, the tradition on your end was sort of wrestling with, is God bound by these things that are almost above and external to God, that God has to do the right thing. God has to be just. God, almost as if justice and love are above God calling the shots. And this again comes back to Plato, as all things footnotedly do. There's the Euthyphro dilemma.
Oh yes.
Do are things good because the gods say it, or do the gods say they're good because they're already good, right? And I think in the Christian tradition, it's not that God commands goodness in a sense of coming up with it or inventing it, nor does goodness exist outside of God as something that God has to obey. Rather, God is goodness itself. And you see this even in scripture to some degree, where it doesn't just say in 1 John that God loves us, but that God is love. And you see that in the Christian Platonic tradition, where the forms are not external things to God, but they are the thoughts in the mind of God. God is being, goodness, truth, and beauty itself would kind of be my way of formulating it. And I think that does escape the Euthyphro dilemma, and it prevents God either inventing new laws as just sort of divine commands, and it also escapes the idea that God is captive to something higher than God.
Well, I completely agree that this occurred to me a long time ago, that this is the solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. Absolutely agree with you.
Yeah. And then I think the second thing, we've God having to sort of mechanically obey his nature like a robot. I don't like the idea of God having to mechanically obey his nature. But I'm not sure how to get out of that without slipping into the voluntaristic side, where there is no eternal essence or form or nature to the divine. And I think part of this just has to do with the fact that free will doesn't make sense. I believe in free will, but I have no idea how I, in my nature, can make free choices that aren't restricted by my nature. And I don't think anyone in the history of thought has ever given a good answer to that question. I still believe in free will, but how my nature somehow makes choices that are in line with my nature, such that they can be called my choices without being restricted by my nature, that's a tension that is felt both in human free will and in terms of, can God make free choices, or is God limited by God's nature? I think there's a tension there, and I don't think there's a fully rational solution, whichever side you lean. The voluntaristic side doesn't seem to be able to uphold the forms, and the rational side makes God seem impersonal, like he's a robot who has to do his programming, and he's not a personal free agent. And I'm not sure how to reconcile those things. I take a stab at it in Self-Promotion, my book Monotheism, but the stab I take in that book very much appeals to mystery in the end. So that would be kind of...
Sorry, now you've told us how the book ends. No,
you don't have to read
the answers. We know the answer already. You've just told us. We have to read the book.
And you can't morally blame me for self-promoting. It's just my nature.
I have no problem with self-promotion.
It's just my nature. I didn't have a free choice. This is just who I am. But yeah, so I think we're hitting on fundamental questions that I think really are irreducible mysteries. And we're coming out on either side of those mysteries.
Yeah, they are mysterious. Can I ask you a question, though, about the prodigal son parable in Luke 15? And this is paradigmatic parable, because it's typical of Jesus' teaching, I would suggest, rather than some kind of anomaly. Is the parable does it speak spiritual truth about God to you? Now, I know the answer because you are a Christian minister. I mean, but that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, how can you justify the parable, given everything you have said? Because the father, obviously, is not the Father God. This is a parable. It's a human father, forgives his son and shows mercy on it and compassion, despite the fact that he's done all these terrible things. He's betrayed his father. He's gone away and all this. The logic of your position would necessitate, should it not, that the father in the parable should have punished his son to ensure that justice was done. Would you not accept the logic of what I've just said?
I would say that, and first of all, you're making an excellent point. This is great. This is a high level discussion. I love it. I would say that when anyone sins against me, there's always a choice of whether or not to swallow that sin or spit it back. In the sense that the sin doesn't just go away. If someone insults me, it is always easier and less hard on myself if I insult them back. If I take the sin and the pain and don't just absorb it, but shoot it back at them. If someone punches me in the face, it hurts less if I punch them right back, right? Like
Try that experiment. I must try it sometime.
Yeah, go for it. Come on, sin is almost in this equation something that's it's there, and I think when we forgive, what we're choosing to do is to swallow and suffer the sin ourselves instead of shooting it back at the sinner. And so I actually think that the cross is not what God does instead of forgiveness. It's kind of symbolic of what forgiveness is. And I applying that to the prodigal son, there is a sin that is suffered and paid for in the story. It's just not the son who suffers it. It's the father. The father chooses to suffer all of the pain of being abandoned, having his money taken early in the inheritance and stolen, and having to watch his son leave him and wait every night for his son to come back, watching at the fields for his son to return, barely able to sleep at night, worried about his son. As a parent myself, that's, and so the father is suffering for the son. He is suffering and paying for the sin instead of shooting it back at the son. When the son said, I want my inheritance early, the father could have knocked him out and said, go to hell.
This is all true. I have no problem.
Let me finish developing it. And so, and when the son returns, the father could either alleviate his anger, because I'm sure he feels angry at what his son has done to him. He can alleviate that anger by striking back at the son and telling him to go away, or he can swallow and suffer the sin himself and choose not to lash back, but to suffer it himself and not to return it. And in that sense, the father is suffering for the sins of the children in their place, even though they should have deserved to suffer it themselves. And that actually very much is what the Christian story is. God is suffering. We are sinful and screwed up. We deserve to be punished. But instead of lashing out at us, God takes all of the trauma and evil that we've done to him and to others and swallows it instead of lashing it back. And I think that's kind of what the cross is symbolic of. In forgiveness, there is always someone paying for the sin. It's just that when you forgive, it's you choosing to pay for it yourself instead of making them pay for it themselves. And that's kind of what the cross is. It's God choosing to pay for the sin instead of shooting it back onto us who deserve to have it shot on us. And if you see the cross not just as a moment in history, but as somehow eternity meeting time in this symbol for where God is in the historical process, I think God is constantly grieved and pained by what humanity is doing. And the thing to do is to alleviate that pain by striking out in rage. But instead, God swallows it and suffers it in our place. That's what forgiveness always is. My kids hit me all the time. And it's the gut level reaction is I want to just smack them back. But I just sit there in my pain and I swallow it. And I think that's what the cross is. I don't think the cross is what God does instead of forgiveness. I think it's precisely what forgiveness is.
Okay. For me, there are two distinct concepts here. One is the parable in Luke 15 of the prodigal son, and secondly, the whole issue of the cross and what that achieves. Coming back to the parable, really, my question was about justice, and it strikes me, everything you said about the father taking on board the consequences of the son's sin and suffering, absolutely, it's all psychologically very authentic from what I think, actually. But in my view, it doesn't address the question of the legal moral responsibility. The son has free will. He's chosen to rebel, absent himself, do all the things we know. Therefore, he and he only, in terms of justice, not in terms of this interpersonal relationship between father and the son taking the blows like you do with your kids, but legally and morally, in terms of his own moral responsibility, he is liable for just punishment. And in the parable, he doesn't receive punishment at all. In fact, that's characteristic of Jesus' teaching in terms of the mercy and forgiveness of God, actually. I think this is what's really going on here, is the mercy and compassion of God. And so I don't think justice happens in that formal sense of someone being punished for their wrongdoing. Everything you said, I agree with. but it's still, in my view, not addressing that point about where is the justice in this story, which on your previous iterations of Christian theology, you've insisted God must implement to be just, to be God at all, a just God at all. So I don't think that fits in quite with what Jesus is teaching, what you're saying in that sense. Coming to the cross, I mean, this is a whole whole different ball game. And I think once we though accept that Jesus' teaching repeatedly stresses the forgiveness of God, the compassion that God has for us and that we should have for our neighbor, generously defined. If forgiveness is part of the message of Jesus, which it is all over the place in the synoptic gospels, there is no need, therefore, for the cross. That the cross then becomes soteriologically redundant. Why? Because forgiveness is already received and communicated in Jesus' ministry in the first place. You don't need any follow-on. And just lastly, I don't really perhaps want to get into the obscurities of the doctrine of the atonement, but you use two concepts which strike me as rather distinct and not the same, but you were using them as if they were the same. You spoke, when it comes to the cross, on the one hand, you spoke about the forgiveness that comes through the cross of sins. On the other hand, you spoke about the payment of a debt. Now, debt repayment and forgiveness are two distinct concepts, and they're not the same. You can forgive someone a debt, or you can pay someone the debt that you owe them, but you can't do both, and they're not the same. If there is payment, there's no forgiveness. If there's forgiveness, there's no payment. They're not the same thing. And to allied them together as if they were semantically the same thing, I think is not my understanding of what payment means and what forgiveness means. Now, I could give a practical example about paying a debt. You're not, when someone pays their debt to me, I don't forgive them. The debt is paid. The discharge is all done. We're all fine. If someone can't pay their debt and I forgive them, I let them off and I absolve them and say, I tell you what, let's wipe it clean, forget about it. That is forgiveness. But they're not the same. If there was a debt paid, it's not forgiveness. And I remember a very eminent English theologian at the University of Birmingham said that in Christianity, there's no forgiveness of sins because of the centrality of this debt repayment model. So it's a transaction rather than forgiveness. And this was John Hick, professor of theology at the University of Birmingham. Of course, I'm sure you know who he is. But in his book, The Metaphor of God, and he was a Christian, he said there's no forgiveness in Christianity for that very reason. At least the orthodox understanding of Christianity, I should say. He had a different understanding, of course.
I think it's interesting because if you're imagining us owing a debt to someone else and then God comes along and pays it, that someone else hasn't forgiven us. And I think that's interesting. But if we borrow money from God and he gives us $100 and we never pay it back, and he says, okay, I'll just forgive you. You don't have to pay it back. He's still paid. He paid the original debt. He has lost part of himself and given of himself in that payment. And so in that sense, God suffers for what we've done and pays for it. I think perhaps we're getting lost in the chronology of it because we're thinking, oh, one has to happen and then the other. But in forgiveness, I am choosing not to demand that you pay the debt back. I'm just going to forever and for always eternally pay it on your behalf. And so the payment of the debt and forgiveness are the same thing because I'm choosing to swallow it myself, which was kind of what I was getting to before. Someone always suffers for the sin in forgiveness. It's just that in forgiveness, you choose to suffer yourself instead of shooting it back. And I think the cross is emblematic that when sin enters the world, God could demand we pay for it, but instead suffers it himself. And that is, in a sense, something that, he's given up himself, he's paying, but he's also forgiving what he's paid, not as something to someone else who then needs to be paid, but just of himself. Does that make sense of the language?
Yeah, I don't think, again, I don't think that's Jesus' message in the Gospels. Actually, I think it's a sophisticated piece of theology, but I don't think it's the gospel. I think we come back to the Sermon on the Mount, say the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, forgive us our trespasses. This is a prayer to God, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, if we were to petition God for forgiveness and he forgave our sin, which of course is the assumption of the prayer, otherwise what's the point of the prayer, then forgiveness is there and then achieved, which means that therefore there is no price paid. That all this sophisticated accountancy language of transaction is simply not there in Jesus' teaching, I would argue. Well, I don't think it is there in his teaching at all. And you have this very strong emphasis on the forgiveness of God. And also I would question the assumption whether God suffers. The idea that God is a suffering being like we are is not something that's found obviously in Islam. God is far above suffering. He does not suffer, although he understands through his knowledge that we suffer, but he doesn't personally get tortured to death and die in any context. That would be seen as an anthropomorphization of it simply doesn't happen.
Yeah. With the transaction stuff in Jesus, I would say a lot of the pieces of the theological case I'm making, all of them are in Jesus, but I'm putting them together in a way that Paul will later put them together. And so what I would say is Jesus does talk a lot about love. He does talk a lot about forgiveness, but he also talks a lot about justice. He talks about justice for the oppressor, the wealthy. He talks about the story of the poor Lazarus being in heaven and the rich man being in hell. He talks a heck of a lot about justice. In fact, Jesus talks about hell more than I think anyone else, like in the
whole Bible.
Yeah. So
exactly
there's
right.
a lot of justice language in Jesus. Like you have to pay for what you've done. And not just in sense of punishing the oppressor, but in the sense of social justice in giving the oppressed the liberation that they deserve. And I see those as two sides of the coin of justice. Justice is giving people what they deserve to get. It's giving the oppressor punishment, and it's giving the oppressed liberation. And so I see Jesus as giving a strong view of justice in both sides of that. Social justice, he's constantly hanging out with the poor, the oppressed, and he's also rebuking the wealthy, the privileged, and the religious leaders. Yeah. So my project is, how do you make sense of his belief in justice and in love and in forgiveness? Well, what I would say is I don't see forgiveness as part of the ontology of who God is. Rather, I see forgiveness as the byproduct of justice and love coming together, almost as if forgiveness is the love child that is produced from what love and justice is.
You don't believe forgiveness is part of God's nature then? You don't think God is merciful and forgiving in his nature?
I would say God is love and God is justice. When you combine those two together, you get forgiveness.
Interesting.
That's kind of what I was saying before. When sin is done, justice is kind of a way of saying it's not going to just disappear. God's not going to snap his fingers and make evil and sin disappear. It's going somewhere. And in sort of, just lashing back at someone, you give it back to that person. But in forgiveness, you choose to swallow it yourself. And in that, something is being done with the sin. It doesn't just appear. Justice is still operative, but in love, you're choosing to swallow it yourself. And that's what forgiveness is. Yeah. And so that's why I would say whenever someone wrongs me, I am always suffering for their sin. It's just that in forgiveness, I choose not to push it back and expel it back onto them, but to just suffer it myself. And I think that's kind of quintessentially what the cross is. Humanity is sinning and paining and hurting each other and God. And at the cross, God chooses to swallow and bear that instead of spitting it back at us, which is why at the cross, Jesus doesn't condemn the people who are killing them. He says, forgive them, right? He's not lashing back out, even though he has the power to do so. The Bible says Jesus could have called down angels to strike them with justice at the cross, but he doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so I see it as a very eloquent summary of what forgiveness is. Someone always suffers for the sin when you're forgiving. It's just that when you forgive, it's you who suffers instead of the one who actually committed the sin. So that would kind of be my thought about that. And I think this is getting really complicated, but this is good. I'm enjoying this.
It is. I'm glad you're up for it, because it wasn't what I either of us planned for. I just wanted, if I may, just speak to what you said about justice in Jesus' teaching, which is, you're absolutely right. It's certainly a major theme in Jesus' teaching. I would suggest, in line with perhaps most biblical scholars, that Jesus' teaching is eschatological. Okay, is apocalyptic. It's not just purely to do with this world and the here and now. So the examples you gave are actually examples on the day of judgment, that God will vindicate this person, he will punish that person, and so on. These are not examples in the here and now. They are, in a sense, future events, the eschatological events. But in the here and now, in this world, if I want, a man came to Jesus and said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone. And then he said, obey the law. This is not the criminal law of England or Canada. This is the Jewish law, the Torah, the 613 commandments of the Torah, of course. So, and this is repeated. This teaching is also found not just in Mark, but in Matthew as well. So the sense that if we want eternal life, the life of the world to come, we are to be Torah observant Jews. We are to follow the Torah as Jesus interpreted it, for sure, not perhaps as some Pharisees interpreted it, but as Jesus interpreted it. We could perhaps read a profound emphasis on love and mercy and the interior, the niyat, the intention, of course, but nevertheless, the law nonetheless. And again, if we have eternal life, we don't need any cataclysmic atonement theory of a sacrifice on the cross to make that happen. Jesus said, obey them. He actually listed 5 commandments in Mark chapter 10 that the man must obey. He went away sad because he was a rich man, and Jesus said he lacked one thing, to give all his money to the poor, and he'll have treasure in heaven. And the man didn't do that, but he could have done. But he chose not to. So I come back to that. I come back to the Lord's Prayer. I come back to many, many parables of Jesus where forgiveness and salvation is present in Jesus' ministry through his preaching. And it's not in any way predicated on a future sacrifice, human sacrifice on a cross. It's there. And the cross has nothing to do with it at all. And this seems to be the charisma of Jesus as we find it in the earliest teaching in the Synoptics. So I think the justice you refer to is in the teaching of Jesus. It's eschatological, but the forgiveness and mercy of God is accessible. The door to forgiveness is through repentance. And there's no hinge on the door. There's no door. You just walk through it and God will forgive you. And this is stunningly like the teaching of Islam. I can't say this is the same, but when I was a Christian, I noted how similar the teaching of Jesus was to the teaching of Islam. And that was one of the things that struck me as a note of authenticity about Islam, that it essentially followed what Jesus was teaching in the earliest traditions that we read.
Yeah, I guess there's a consistent theme in Christianity that the cross is almost this transcendent, like it's this moment where eternity is pierced by time and the two meet, much like the incarnation. And so it's not something that's bound in time chronologically in that sense. Time works backwards almost from this moment, which kind of in an ironic parallel, the BC and AD framework kind of acknowledges, not that that proves anything. And so this is one of the reasons why Christians believe the Old Testament people who existed before the cross were also saved through what Christ does on the cross. So it's not like the cross is an event that occurs and then that message begins. It's an event that works backwards and forwards in all of time. Yeah. And if you're talking about Jesus's ministry not being about it, but in the Gospels, he's constantly gesturing towards the cross. He's talking about how the Son of Man will die, how we must pick up our cross daily. And the disciples are always like, what are you talking about? And he's like, you'll see, but the cross is coming. They're going to kill me. In the Gospels, the whole time that he's talking about forgiveness, he's also talking about his inevitable death. And that's not just in the Gospel of John, which is like, the later, that's in the Synoptics as well. It is, so yeah. I think his message of forgiveness is always bound up in this cross language where there's something that's going to come and then it's going to make sense. And so, yeah, I don't see the issue that you're putting forward as an issue for traditional Christian theology. I think it can kind of accommodate all of what you're saying about that. And forgiveness, it's not like after the cross we start talking about forgiveness. I think forgiveness has always been there, precisely because of what Christ does and will do at the cross, working backwards and forwards. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say there. And I think the issue again for me just comes back to, okay, there's forgiveness in the sort of Islamic picture you're saying, but again, where is the justice? And if the justice isn't observed fully all the time, both in the sense of justice for the oppressor, but also social justice for the oppressed, to me, this is a voluntaristic God who isn't able to ground objective right and wrong. Because I think of justice as bound up with right and wrong. And yet I also think Islam does value justice as a virtue. So I'm trying to make sense of how it can do that without saying something like what we're saying. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, absolutely. I agree. You're right. There are multiple detailed predictions on the lips of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, particularly predicting the death of Jesus. I would, by the way, still stress that when Jesus speaks about forgiveness, say on the Sermon on the Mount, he's not connecting it with any cross. He simply says, God, the petition is forgiveness of sins now. It's nothing. It doesn't mention a human sacrifice. But the problem is, as most critical historians have noticed, not theologians, you're right about the Christian theologians, talking about the intersection of the eternal into the temporal and so on. All that's there in Christian theology, absolutely right. But for critical historians, most of them have concluded these so-called passion predictions are not historical for very clear reasons why. We can go into the reasons why, but they're not seen as on the lips of Jesus at all. They don't make sense of certain events that happened. That may be an issue we want to go into. But coming back to justice and Islam, like in justice and Jesus' teaching, justice is eschatological. If there's no justice in this world, if for example, my neighbor gets away with murder, literally in this world, and he never faces a court, it does not mean he will not face a court. He will face the eternal court of justice on the day of judgment. And the day of judgment in the Quran is a major, major theme, as it is in the teaching of Jesus, actually. So there will be justice. God will have the last word. The good will be separated from the believers and the unbelievers, the good and the evil, the sheep and the goats, it's there in Matthew's gospel, will be decided upon on that day, even if it doesn't happen in this life. But forgiveness is available in this life for all people who call with a sincere heart on God. That's what Jesus teaches. So I think is the tension, as my old theology teaches to say, between the now and the not yet. This idea, yeah, I'm sure you've heard that thing before.
So is there no ultimate forgiveness?
There is. For those, God does forgive people, but he also chooses to send to hellfire those whom he deems should be punished eternally in hellfire. And that teaching is found in Matthew's gospel in abundance, as you yourself said. So it's not just in this.
Well, what I'm wondering is how God can ultimately, in the eschatological sense, both forgive and be just without somehow love and just, like, why is he choosing to forgive some and to justly punish others? And I think I'm kind of wondering, like, it kind of sounds like at the end of all things, God will be just to some and forgive others and not impose his justice upon them. And that's precisely the issue that I'm having, is how can God be justice itself and love itself and not be loving and just to all people, if that makes sense, in an ultimate sense. Like, I'm not seeing what the ultimate does other than just illustrate the point further.
We have been given guidance about how to avoid hellfire and how to get to heaven in Revelation. So we are obliged, and we have the choice, but obliged to worship God and not to worship our desires. We are commanded to do good, to forgive our neighbors, to feed the poor, to do justice, as you rightly say over and over. You're absolutely right to say that. So we are supposed to live theocentric lives honoring God. if we do that in good faith and we try our best, not being perfect because we're created imperfect according to the Quran, if we do our best, we can have a confident hope in God's mercy, but not a complacent kind of hope. Well, I've heard some Christians say, and I know they're not representative of the best, of course, oh, well, I've got a ticket to paradise. I believe in Jesus. It doesn't matter what I do. I'm going to go to paradise. That's not Christianity, I know, but that's not Islam either. So we are to have a reverent fear of God and not to be complacent, but we are to put our hope in him because he is merciful and loving. And that we put our hope in God's mercy, and inshallah, we will go to paradise. So we're not kind of left without guidance about how to succeed in this matter. And it's very similar to what Jesus taught as well. It's not a mystery. If we want to be pleasing to God, then we need to behave righteously and love God and love our neighbor.
I think so. What my tradition would probably say back is that, okay, you're saying we have some sense of what we need to do.
Yeah.
And so in as much as we do it, we don't need to be forgiven. And in as much as we, I mean, you're saying we can kind of do it. And so, then God won't punish us for those things. But if we're doing the right things here and now, it's not forgiveness. It's just you've figured it out and you're doing it. And then the parts that we haven't done right, like those are forgiven, but then how is justice applied to them if they are forgiven? And I think the thing that you're kind of saying is that in the Islamic end, it kind of sounds like a mixture. God will be 50% merciful and 50% just, and kind of mix them together, and merciful to some, just to others. I think the Christian tradition is saying God is 100% loving and 100% just to everyone at all times. And so God, and this comes back to Plato, because God could never, even for 1 second, not be what God is, or else he's violated the forms that bind all of existence ontologically and morally. And so morality is an absolute because morality has been violated. God has to uphold the forms at all times, has to be 100% just and 100% loving at all times, or else the forms are not absolute and moral reality isn't absolute and you have relativism. So it can't just be like God decides, oh, I'm not going to be just here because, he can't be 50% just and 50% merciful. He's got to be those things 100% of the time, or else they're not eternal, absolute, objective forms grounded in the ontology of existence, and you get relativism. So like for me, Plato is huge here. Anyways, you go ahead because you're obviously going to respond.
No, that's interesting. I don't think that God is obliged to behave in all these ways simultaneously to one person. So he's got to be just and angry and merciful and loving and compassionate and holy and all at the same time to be consistent. Otherwise, he's not eternally God or something. I really don't see that. I don't see that in Revelation at all. As I say, there is the saying in Islamic tradition where God says, "My mercy prevails over my wrath." So God chooses, maybe this is the voluntarist thing you don't like so much, but God chooses to be merciful, like in the parable of the prodigal son, to the errant son who repents and comes back. He chooses to condemn on the day of judgment, the sheep and the goats, the parable in Matthew's gospel, to condemn some and for failing to do justice, to visit the sick, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to visit those who are in hospital, all these things. They fail to do that. They are condemned forever. And those who do all those things will go to paradise forever. This is Jesus' teaching according to Matthew's gospel. So it's not, God doesn't have to mechanically deal in this absolutist way all the time. He can be merciful. You see, I think maybe the voluntarist model has something to be said for it. God can choose to be merciful to whom he chooses to be merciful in his wisdom. Now, I may not understand that, but that is the character or the names of God as revealed in Revelation. If I can't get my head around that, so be it. I'm not God. I'm just a puny little human. But I'm satisfied that is revelation. And I trust in God, in his mercy, that one day I will enter paradise. In the Islamic traditions, I'm sure you know, those of us who are terrible sinners in this life, but who still believe in oneness of God, will go to paradise, though they may spend a period in hellfire. And this may sound a bit like purgatory in some ways, and there's a similarity, I think, there. But so a person may spend a period of hellfire before then going on to paradise. So they were punished. So there is justice there, as well as ultimate forgiveness, redemption, and mercy shown, even to the very serious sinner, as long as they have faith in one God and don't betray that one fundamental truth of their existence. If they do betray that, then they're in serious trouble.
Yeah. I think what we're perhaps coming to, I mean, you were just saying the voluntarist view kind of has something to be said for it. And that God can kind of just choose to, treat one person one way and another person the other way. It's not, but it's not, he's not forced into it based on his nature or essence or forms. And I think if you want to go that direction, you can, but then you are in some ways standing in opposition to the rationalist Platonic tradition in that sense, where in some way God can't violate the fundamental ontology and moral ontology of reality. And once you say that, if God's freedom trumps his forms, nature, essence, then there's nothing to say God couldn't choose to act unloving, or to act in ways that are entirely inconsistent with everything you've heard in the Quran, because God isn't bound by who he is or by any eternal absolute form. Will trumps all. And so, I mean, this is almost Nietzschean, where the will is the only absolute. The divine will trumps the divine forms of justice and goodness and love. And so it's freedom. And in that sense, I would argue that it leads to a nihilistic cosmos, because at the end of the day, ontology is not grounded in an absolute eternal form of goodness and morality and meaning, but is grounded in a will that's higher than those things and can choose to violate them. And so for me, that leads to nihilism.
I think that you're right. I see the logic of it, but there's more to Islam than even what you said.
I'm sure. I'm not saying all Islam is nihilist. I'm just saying, I'm trying to figure out the logic here.
Physically, I mean that God is sovereign. He is the owner of the heavens and the earth. He is the creator of all things. And as I say, he is sovereign. We are not sovereign. We are contingent. We are creatures. And so if we are to align ourselves with reality and to God's will, we must submit to him. And so there is this kind of fundamental ontology there about God as a necessary being and us as contingent beings. And he possesses traditionally 99 names, 99 attributes of God, not just one or two, like God is love, perhaps, or one other, but many, and we haven't spoken of most of them, of course. And so he behaves as he chooses according to his wisdom. And so we don't always understand why he does things, but nevertheless, we trust that behind the scenes of this show that we see around us in the world, there is the unseen divine presence who controls all things and who means well and for us and who decrees all things. And that we can, in a sense, live lives pleasing to him. And one day, God willing, we will be with him in paradise, having that vision of God that Aquinas spoke about as well, this vision, beatific vision. So I think there's plenty of wonderful moral guidance in Islam. God has these incredible attributes. And we sometimes like to think, well, he must behave this way and behave that way. He behaves as he chooses, according to his wisdom, according to his attributes. And, we leave it. And at the day of judgment, we'll sort out all these disputes between you and I and everyone else about what really happened, what should happen, who God is really like. We will find out one day the truth of these matters, because God will tell us. We will be informed of that. And in fact, that is a constant refrain in the Quran, I noticed, that God will inform you, humankind, of all these things about which you used to dispute. He actually says that over and over. So we're not necessarily going to get the answers in this life, but we will one day.
Well, and I think that's a totally valid answer. I don't dismiss appeals to mystery. I think every religious group ultimately falls onto that at some point. I think even atheists, everyone appeals to mystery at some point in their worldview. We just disagree on where to place it. And I think as Christians, I place the mystery in the Trinity, right? Like for me, I think that's a valid tack to take. I think it does illustrate, though, why the Christian view of the atonement would say, we might not be perfect, but we're still trying to resolve something without just appealing to mystery, and to somehow make sense of justice and love coming together at the cross in a way that can make sense. And so I think it has something to contribute in that space because it's attempting to resolve something that I think most other worldviews have to ultimately hand over to mystery because they can't resolve it. And I think it's part of the beauty of what the cross is attempting to do. It's attempting to resolve it. And maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe we can just say it's beyond us. But it's an interesting attempt either way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think for Muslims and many others, the idea of something being beautiful, which involves the horrible torturing to death of an innocent human being on the cross 2,000 years ago, and somehow this is a demonstration of justice or love, is beyond our comprehension. Jesus was innocent. He was not someone to be punished justly. So therefore, he was a victim of injustice. If God, in the Islamic tradition, God does not require the torturing to death of anyone to atone for sin. What we believe, as indeed Jesus taught, as I've given a number of examples, that God freely forgives whom he pleases and doesn't forgive whom he pleases according to his wisdom and his justice. It doesn't require the torturing to death of a human being to effect atonement. And I think is that central doctrine that has scandalized many people. And I know many people who become Muslims rather than Christians because of it, because the doctrine is so repellent to them, and it's the opposite of beauty. It's ugliness. It's repellent. Now, I don't want to attack. I'm just saying this how it appears to many people that this horrific torture. And you go into Catholic churches and you see this blood-stained, dying individual hanging from a cross in sculptures and whatnot, crucifixes, and we're supposed to have made that person die. And the traumatic effect that has on children, how it can traumatize kids who see this and feel guilty and made to feel guilty by Christians and saying, well, they may not be said this explicitly, but the message is there. Because of your sin, little boy, this innocent man is being tortured to death. This is so traumatic spiritually for people that many simply turn to atheism, actually. And obviously this is very famous in Catholics, and so many former Catholics are atheists now because of this kind of story. So I think it can be very repellent. And the simple gospel of Jesus, which we find in the Quran as well, of God's mercy and forgiveness to those who turn to him in sincere repentance, is much more spiritually authentic and also doesn't repel. It offers hope of God's mercy. It's good news for humanity, as opposed to the other message. However much one may beautify it with words like, oh, God loves us and so on. The reality is that poor man being tortured to death, who is innocent and cannot be in any way a just human sacrifice. There are no human sacrifices in our religion, in the religion of Islam, I should say.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting about the Christian tradition is in some ways it's meant to negate the history of finite sacrifices, precisely by God offering an ultimate sacrifice that renders all other sacrifices necessary. Mm-hmm. And so precisely that's, I think what's interesting there though, is it's not God taking some random human and saying, hey, you're going to be the scapegoat for everyone, and then torturing them. Okay. I think what's essential to this narrative is it's God coming down and suffering in our place. It's not God punishing someone else. It's God suffering for us and choosing to enter into our sufferings and bear it upon himself. I think this is somewhat similar to, like, if my kid does something horrible and has to pay a fine of $1,000, it's not just for me to say, hey, judge, make that other kid over there pay it. And then the judge, that's not just.
No.
And that's not loving.
No.
But if I say, I'm going to pay that for him, I'm going to suffer that burden myself, someone is paying it off, and it is loving. And I don't think it's unfair because I've freely chosen to do it. God's not forcing someone to pay for the sins of humanity. God's choosing to do it God's self. That's the difference between me saying, oh, I don't want my kid to suffer, so let's make some other poor kid do it, and me saying I'll suffer for my kid. And on a phenomenological sense, every day I choose to suffer for my kid in their place. It's just a phenomenological thing baked into reality. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not punishing an innocent person who's like, hey, what the hell? Why are you punishing me? It's God saying, like a parent, I'm going to suffer this for you. And I think that resonates. But let me address some of the other things you said about traumatizing kids. Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of things that are traumatic about truth. And so you don't spew them at children. I think Martin Scorsese films are deeply beautiful and true, but I'm not going to show it to my 5-year-old kid. I think it's something you need to, you build to it. Yeah. And, it's interesting, the language of traumatizing kids, because a lot of the rhetoric of the right in America right now is, hey, don't teach kids about the history of slavery in this country, because that makes them feel guilty and like they're bad and like Americans aren't good. And it's like, well, maybe we should be accountable for that. Maybe it's uncomfortable, but maybe we have to step into that uncomfort and accept that we're fallen, finite humans who make mistakes and hurt each other. And maybe the kids in the schools should be taught that their ancestors enslaved other people. Maybe not when they're 4, but certainly a proper education is one that does not shy away from truths that have the potential to upset. Mm-hmm. And then I would finally say that, the aesthetics thing, there is something horrific about the cross, but part of the beauty of the Romantic movement in the Western context was appreciating that beauty isn't just hallelujah, glory, lights and trees. It's the macabre. It's entering into death and finding beauty there, entering into silence and darkness and pain and suffering and finding some ways to redeem even those things. And so I think any full aesthetics has to find beauty not just in triumph and glory, but suffering and pain. And I think aesthetics, because you emphasize the beauty aspect there. Yeah. I think it has to enter into that. And I think the beauty of the Christian story is that God isn't just this transcendent being up in the clouds going, oh, look at the light and the halo and the glorious painting of my awesomeness, but that God descends down into our suffering, because humanity is suffering. You just brought up the genocides occurring in the Middle East. I've brought up the Holocaust. What kind of God would we want who doesn't enter into that in some way? Mm-hmm. And I think part of the beauty of Christianity is its symbol is not just the resurrection of an all-powerful, awesome, beatific, beautiful God. It's the raw, gritty reality of a cross. It's God entering into the suffering and the grittiness of reality, because reality is suffering and gritty and horrible. And a God who doesn't enter into that in that some way has no empathy with us and has nothing to say with us in the midst of those sufferings. In the same way, like soldiers who come back from war feel like they can't talk to anyone else because no one else has been through what they've been through. They can only talk to other soldiers who've been through it. The Christian narrative is that God was in the trenches with us all along, suffering with us. And that's a God that I can actually pray to, because that's a God who I can actually relate to and who can relate to me, because that God is a suffering God, not just a triumphant God, and whose beauty is the beauty of wounded nail holes as a love cry to us, because he went through it for us. I think there's definitely aesthetic ways to make sense of this story that may be upsetting, might be difficult, but that doesn't mean they're not beautiful in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand. Must be able to draw to a conclusion shortly, because we go on. But I'll just say a few things. I'm in danger of perpetuating this for another hour, but there are statements in the Bible which says God is not a man. There's a statement in Numbers to that effect. But there's also that the Jesus portrayed in the Gospels on the cross is not exactly getting the message. He's not on message, because as it says in Mark, Jesus cries out to God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Here we have a cry of despair, as portrayed by Mark, of someone who had no idea what was happening and was clearly emotionally felt abandoned by God. My God, why have you abandoned me? This doesn't fit in quite with the narrative of God becoming a man and happily doing this to save the world. Here was a victim who had been horribly tortured to death and had no idea what was going on. And also that there is a theological problem of God being the immortal, eternal God dying at all. There are repeated statements in the New Testament and in the Old, it's there in Romans, where Paul says God is immortal. And by definition, that means God does not die. It's impossible for God to die. Why? Because he is immortal, he's eternal. And therefore, to say that the immortal dies, there's actually a line from the hymn, is it by John Wesley or something, which Christians sing in church? I used to sing it. is at the very least paradoxical, but more straightforwardly, it's a contradiction. God does not die. And then there are numerous other problems to do with the incarnation itself. How can a mortal being be inhabited by an immortal being? How can Jesus be simultaneously all powerful and weak, being God and man? How can he be simultaneously all-knowing and ignorant, being omniscient and ignorant, because he professes ignorance many times in the Gospels? And how can he be immortal and mortal at the same time? There are all these paradox upon paradox upon paradox, or as I would say, contradiction upon contradiction upon contradiction, in the very heart of this idea of incarnation. And I come back to this other point, which is that if the issue is forgiveness, Jesus' message in the gospel over and over is very clear. Forgiveness is freely available. If you call on God, who is merciful and compassionate, he will forgive you. This whole language of human sacrifice, which is exactly what it is, Jesus was a human being, is repugnant to Judaism. There was never any prediction that the Messiah, you mentioned the Old Testament and how it looked forward to Jesus. There was no prophecy anywhere in the Jewish Bible that the Messiah would die, be buried, and for sin, as a sin atonement for the world. This is a Christian idea which never existed in the history of Judaism until the beginnings of Christianity. You will not find it anywhere in the Bible or any non-biblical writer ever talking about the Messiah dying for sin as an atonement for sin anywhere. So this is, if it had been central to God's message to mankind, he would have communicated this through his prophets, through Jeremiah, Isaiah, Micah, and Moses, and all the rest of them. He never once mentioned this, that a Messiah that God would become a man. So this is a new idea, unknown to the Jewish people, the people of God, unknown in the Torah. And it doesn't also fit with the charisma of Jesus, the message of Jesus, which we find reaffirmed and restated in the Quran, which is why Islam is the purified final statement of the truth about God and of Jesus for all of mankind, which is why people should follow Islam.
Well, I love it. You're like, we should end, and then let me say a few things.
You have I must be a host here. You have the last word. I'm not going to have that. So you have the last word, sir.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that I know people disagree about Old Testament and how Jesus fits into Judaism, and people can disagree on the alleged prophecies. But I mean, I'm sure you've heard this one from Isaiah 53.
I have.
That is, I'm not, but I'm just going to end on it because you don't get to retort. That was.
No, you have the last word.
I mean, in Isaiah 53, it says, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter." So I think there's different ways to interpret that, but I don't think Christians are crazy for interpreting it in a way that points to Jesus. And I'll also look at what you said about on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where it seems like Jesus is like giving up. I'd say, first of all, I think precisely in the Christian tradition, what sin does is separates us from God. If someone was having an affair with their best friend's boyfriend or partner or whatever, that would create emotional and psychological distance between them and their best friend. It gets in between them. Their sin pulls them apart. And I think in the Christian narrative, that's what sin does with us and God. It pulls us apart from God, and it creates this fracture in the relationship between God and man. And so I think if Jesus is going to truly take upon himself the human condition and suffer fully the weight of what we have done and are, he has to be separated and fractured from the divine in the way that humans have been forsaken and separated and fractured from the divine. But I would also say that more importantly, I don't think he's truly giving up on the mission, because Psalm 22 that he quotes from starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? But the psalm ends in victory. It's a victory psalm that rises from despair and death into victory, which is, of course, what the narrative of the cross to resurrection is. So even his quote of Psalm 22, where he seems to say, my God, why have you forsaken me, is not despair. This is the lowest I'm going to go, but it's quoting a psalm that's ultimately about victory. So I don't think he's giving up on his message there. And finally, I would say this question of God dying. How can the eternal become temporal and die like a being within time and space? How can the absolute become particular? How can the transcendent become immanent? Those are questions that are great questions. Ultimately, I don't know if any worldview has a great answer to them. How does a timeless God begin to create a temporal universe? Because beginning to do it is something that already requires time. How do eternity and time relate to each other is a question that no one has a good answer to, whether you're Christian, Islamic, atheist, even science doesn't have a great answer to it, which is why after the Big Bang, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. How time and eternity, transcendence and immanence relate is a mystery for all worldviews. And Christianity, in its central mystery, just takes that mystery on. How can God be the eternal transcendent Father up there, but also the incarnate temporal Son down here? I don't know, but that is a mystery not just for Christians, but for all worldviews, because nobody knows how time and eternity relate. And no one has a good answer to that. So I don't think it presses against my worldview more than any others. But what I would say, and in one final desperate act of self-promotion.
Oh, no, your books, of course. Yes.
That is literally this question of how time and eternity relate and how God can be this Trinity, a Father who is timeless up there and yet a temporal Son down here. That is literally the point of my whole book.
Wow.
So if you're interested in how Christians can think it's rational to believe that and to believe in the Trinity and the incarnation, check out Monotheism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub, because it's literally, that's what the whole book is about. And I don't say I resolve it in the sense, I don't resolve the mystery, but I give an account of why it's rational to embrace that mystery. And I give something similar to what I just said. And so I would, if you're interested in that subject, this is my attempt to give you a Christian's response to it. So check that out. And honestly, if you want to do a thing on this and have these discussions again, specifically about the incarnation and the Trinity, I'm happy to do that because it's my favorite topic to talk about.
Okay, well, maybe we will, God willing. Maybe we will.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. I think this was a vigorous. I hope it didn't come off as too aggressive. I was just excited. This was a good talk.
No, it wasn't planned to have a debate like this. I must say, we were going to talk about Plato, and we ended up having a good old-fashioned Muslim-Christian discussion, which is great, by the way. We don't have to follow rigidly anything. But I do want to thank you, Dr. Jonathan Lyonhart. What a marvelous name, Lyonhart, for your being an honored guest on Blogging Theology today. And I'll put some links to your stuff in particularly your podcast. Actually, what's it called again? Your podcast,
the Spiritually Incorrect Podcast. And I think our connection was actually through Shoaib Malik, who we've had him on multiple times to talk about Islam and Christianity, and so those episodes are on there too. So check those out. He just did one on design in Islam and Judaism and Christianity that was really interesting. So he's great.
So he is. He's fantastic. He's a lecturer at Edinburgh University and a mutual friend. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Fantastic time. And maybe we will do something similar again in the future, God willing. So thank you very much. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.